Welcome to the audit training for Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority grantees. This webinar is intended to provide the grantee with information on what to expect when selected for an audit. Once selected, taking definitive steps to organize your documentation will assist in making the process efficient. The goal for the auditor is to spend up to 3 days in your office and work during your normal business hours. The Code of Federal Regulations, Title II, covering grants and agreements, requires monitoring of grantees to ensure federal awards are used for the purpose authorized. The fiscal audit is performed as a complement to the ongoing programmatic monitoring and is more forensic in nature. The audit objective is to review the grantee's accounting of funds and determine compliance with establishing an accounting system and adequate internal controls providing for the full accountability of revenue and expenses, submitted financial reports are accurate, reliable, and in agreement with the grantee's general ledger, and expended funds are allowable and in agreement with the grantee's last approved budget. The audit process begins when the grantee receives an introductory email from the auditor. The email will propose the dates for the audit. The dates are typically 2 weeks or longer from the date of the email. The grantee should respond with the confirmation of the dates or request alternative dates if necessary. Attached to the email to schedule the audit will be a list of documents required upon arrival. A listing also identifies documents that the auditor will need to retain for the audit files. In order to substantiate reported expenses, the grantee must have available their general ledger, chart of accounts, financial statements, and payroll register. These documents are necessary to ascertain how funds are being spent. In the event the grantee fails to deliver these documents, the audit will end immediately due to non-compliance, and the grantee will be referred to the Office of General Counsel. Additional documentation may be required to support money spent by budget line. Shown here is the expanded list of documentation related to our audit of payroll-related expenditures. The document request list will detail documentation needed for all other approved budget lines. Shown here is the list of those non-personnel line items and includes, but may not be limited to, travel, equipment, supplies, contractual services, and indirect costs. Support for these items may include purchase orders, invoices, contracts, and leases. The auditor will send a questionnaire relative to your agency's internal control policies as seen here. Specific questions related to the agency's policies and procedures must be completed, and the grantee must identify key staff in the organization responsible for specific tasks. A narrative response is required for the questions that delve into specific accounting procedures and practices employed at your agency. To the extent possible, the questionnaire should be sent to the auditor prior to the start of field work. This questionnaire provides evidence of your agency's internal controls. Upon arrival, the auditor will need a workspace that has internet access. The grantee must have a point of contact available for the duration of field work who is able to answer questions regarding the financial reporting and gather additional documentation as needed. Further, the auditor will want the grantee to show the reporting of grant revenue received from ICJIA in the general ledger and trace it to the agency's bank statement for each fiscal report. To support an efficient review of the grant expenses, grantees should consider having the fiscal report followed by the documents that support each balance listed by category. For example, the review of salary and fringe reported is intended to ensure that grant funds are used for grant-approved positions working on grant activities during the grant period. Documentation testing begins with the fiscal report. We tie total payroll reimbursed to that reported in the general ledger. We agree the general ledger expense to the actual payments made to staff as reported in the payroll register. We verify the amount paid to the employee is supported by the total time worked per the timesheets and we confirm the portion of time spent on grant activities as shown on the personnel activity reports and appropriate time certifications that are to be completed either quarterly or semi-annually. Lastly, we will agree the total payroll paid to the bank statements and review canceled checks. We will review the internal journals and records to test the accuracy of the account reporting. We will also trace reported costs to external third-party support, such as contracts, leases, vendor invoices, bank statements, or any other support that is available. Where subrecipients are funded with money that passes through your agency, our audit involves reviewing documentation that confirms your oversight of the sub-grantees and the accuracy and allowability of costs submitted by them for reimbursement. Indirect costs are costs not directly associated with the grant program but necessary for your overall operation. Whether using a negotiated rate or the de minimis 10% rate, the audit will test the indirect amount reimbursed by the grant. A grantee must be prepared to show documentation of payments made with indirect cost funds. Match funds are also tested to ensure that payments made with match funds are allowable and that the total amount of match funds agree with the grant provisions. Common findings in the test of both payroll and non-personnel expenses include cutoff, and that's where expenses are paid outside of the grant term. A grantee must ensure pay periods and/or service dates fall within the term of the grant. If the period begins or ends outside of the grant term, an adjustment must be made to back out the amount that is outside of the grant. Time reporting. This involves timesheets that do not agree to hours paid per the payroll register or personnel activity reports that do not agree to time certifications or the percent allocated per the approved budget. A change in salary, where a change in an individual's salary or fringe amount from the last approved grant budget was made without proper notification to or approval from the grant monitor. Insufficient documentation. Expenses paid that are not included in the last approved budget or paid to staff not on the grant budget. Where a grantee does not have a conflict of interest clause in the purchasing policy, the grantee has failed to monitor subrecipients, or expenses that were paid with match funds that are not allowable. If there are any additional audit steps or tests to be conducted after field work, or if more information is requested and not available, the auditor will communicate what is needed within the time frame for delivery. The auditor will take time to answer questions the grantee may have and relay identified areas of potential questionable costs or reportable conditions. Finally, the grantee will get some indication of when the audit report will be delivered. The grantee is expected to provide a corrective action plan that can be implemented at the agency and, once enacted, will mitigate the findings noted in the audit report. In the event the grant period is still open, ICJIA may allow the grantee to deduct the disallowed costs from future reimbursement requests. Absent any such agreement for repayment, the grantee is expected to return the amount of disallowed cost within the specified time frame. Corrective action plans must be submitted to the auditor no later than 30 days after receipt of the audit report. The audit is closed once the corrective action plan is approved and any identified disallowed costs are repaid. A grantee is subject to an annual GATA audit following its fiscal year end. The GATA audit is separate and distinct from the grantee audit described here. For GATA compliance, grantees have an obligation to upload their financial information annually into the GATA portal. That requires completion of the audit certification within 60 days of the fiscal year end, uploading prepared financial statements, completion of the current year-end fiscal report or cipher, having the proper audit conducted and uploaded into the audit package based on the audit type, and completion of the state data collection form. GATA requirements can be discussed further with your grant monitor. Thank you for your participation.